Hi, it's Connor McKenzie, and I'm going to talk about how to conduct in-depth reporting. So, basically, how to make your articles more interesting, more detailed. So we're going to get into it. So, what is like a good article? So, it has multiple sources, um, facts like statistics and things, interviews, um, multiple angles. So, what that means is like, and here's a big misconception. So, like a feature story, right? We want to be impartial, so we want to have all sides of the stories. But like take an opinion article, for example. Maybe it's that blank is good. Well, maybe so like often you think that the article is all about that one angle, but actually to strengthen an article, no matter what it is of any kind, you could basically have kind of what's the other side, and then if it's like an opinion article, maybe like counterpoints or like why those points may be less valid or kind of helping your opinion. But that way, people see all sides, and maybe like if it's an opinion again, kind of why those may or may not be good talking points. An interesting topic, and we'll get more into that. Why? Like, why in-depth articles? It's because to be a journalist is to be a storyteller. So what I mean by that is that um, every article is a story. It tells a story of some kind. Maybe it's the story of a movie review is a story, right? And so is like Zach's mullet article about uh, mullets through time. Um, so people love reading stories about people. So humans have kind of a natural thing for learning about the human, I wouldn't say struggle, but just different things that humans are doing, right? So kind of activities and uh, stories kind of like that. A good article will never be written if it isn't brainstormed first. So our brainstorms, right? Often they're kind of on the quiet side, right? There's usually a couple people that have a lot of article ideas. And I think part of that comes from we don't know where or what we can write actual articles about. Um, and often people don't know where to find good story ideas. And basically, the answer is open your eyes. Pretty great CGI, if you ask me. So there are stories everywhere, and you just have to know where to look. And you'll never get a good scoop if you don't know where to scoop. That was a really horrible analogy, but we're going to work with it for now. So some great places to start. Big changes at West. So a couple years ago, we got new tables. The fabrication fab lab, the cafe, things like that are big. Maybe it's big policy changes. A couple years ago, it was, I don't know if it's 2 years ago, it was the phone pockets. Maybe it's something you heard from a friend of a friend. So like little rumors, like maybe there's a fallout shelter beneath our school, things like that. Sometimes they might have no credibility behind them, but others you might lead to a good article and maybe doing a little bit more investigation. The New Berlin Historical Society. So in New Berlin, there's an organization called the New Berlin Historical Society, and so what they do is that they basically they've compiled the history of New Berlin. So New Berlin, as boring as it is, because it is boring, is actually pretty interesting. So New Berlin has been around since the 1800s. It's a pretty old city, and although now we just have chains and like really gross suburban perfectness, there's a lot of history behind there of old schools, old factories, and I know like Zach wrote about even, and it's not just New Berlin, but even in the area with the Nike missile sites and other things like that. So what they do is that they have archives, and so they have a website, and you can email them at any time. And it's a one guy that usually he's the president. I forget, it's David something. I forget his name, but you can email him at any time, and usually within an hour or two he gets back to you. But they have great knowledge about everything. They also have a New Berlin Historical Park, so that's a couple buildings that are, think like Old World Wisconsin, but like less dramatic. So they have some old artifacts there too. But any kind of article relating to things in New Berlin is really great to maybe check in and out. They don't always have things, but so an an investigative article that I'm writing now is about a fallout shelter, and so like immediately they didn't have any information, but they helped point me to a lawyer who went to the school back in the 60s and he had more information. So even if they don't have something in their archives, they'll be able to point you somewhere where you may find more information. So something weird, so something strange, something, maybe it's something that you haven't really, you don't exactly fully know about. Maybe it's something that's kind of suspicious, look into it. Interesting people. So there's a lot of characters anywhere you go. And if you come across them, they can actually be pretty interesting and they always have good stories. News articles about New Berlin. So usually it's about something bad, but sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes like the Waukesha Freeman or the Milwaukee Journal, excuse me, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel will write something about New Berlin. Now, some of those things are a little bit above our what we cover. Usually crimes, but not necessarily. I try to look into a pipe bombing that happened last year, but things like that, if they're like open investigations, you run into some legal challenges, but don't let that totally discourage you. New Berlin history. So yeah, New Berlin is really interesting. New Berlin's had quite its number of scandals, believe it or not, and little things just kind of, there's so much to unpack, and often it usually gets swept under the rug because I just want to leave New Berlin. So, you don't really think New Berlin's that great, but it is. But you gotta peel back a couple layers. Bulletin boards. So bulletin boards are cool. Now, it was hard to find some good pictures, but so picture a bulletin board, right? They have all these flyers, and but you can find them in like groceries, like Pick and Save usually has one, various public places. And people just put in flyers for everything from like clubs and different events. And sometimes you'll stumble across some unique little niche kind of weird thing. And you can make an article about basically anything you find on a bulletin board. There's usually a story behind everything. Like I know we have like folk festivals of that show different culture and stuff at different times. And you can find some cool things. Old people. So old people can be boring. And the further you go up there, people that have lived a long time usually have some good stories. And often it might not even be from people you expect. So at our school, you may know substitute teacher Mr. Kip. So um, talk to some of these people, and usually you'll get stories. So he was telling me about he actually went to high school with basically the person that currently runs Saruji's chocolate bars. So I'm looking into that for an article, and you often find they have a lot to say and they like talking because everyone loves to talk about themselves. I know I do. I talk way too much, but if you just kind of ask them about, and you can start off not really knowing much, you can go in general, like just tell me about your life. But usually, there's some story or some crazy thing that they did, and they can make good stories, because they're people, citizens of New Berlin, and they're part of our community. So I don't really know if you could go and like interview people at a nursing home or like, but wherever, obviously being respectful and letting them tell their story. But you can find some good stories places. Something questionable you saw in somebody's Snapchat story. That I put that in there is more of a joke, but maybe it might lead to something. But again, back to the bulletin boards, flyers. People are advertising everything all the time. So, maybe look into that. Business cards. Um, there's stories of student journalists finding a business card in a grocery store. And I heard this story at Kempa, and basically it led them on some shady journey, finding some pretty interesting things out. But people jobs, so that's very vague, but not like McDonald's, but like your parents probably not. Obviously, don't interview your parents, but like people who have maybe different interesting careers. So I know like my mom has a family friend that's like a Navy SEAL, and everyone has a family friend of some kind that has done something. I know that I'm pretty sure Senior Bronze, I think it's like his brother is a football player in the NFL. But there's usually some people with some cool stories that you might be able to interview if you kind of see around, look around, and maybe a job doesn't seem that interesting at first, but maybe some things that have come along with it. So like my neighbor, he was a chemist, but at one point the FBI had to like watch over his lab. There's usually some crazy stories that you'll find, and it can lead to some interesting articles, or you might find a place on public records. So court documents, legal documents, government documents, you can request with public records. And the Student Press Law Center has helps you out, filing forms and stuff, but we'll get into that more later. Weird clubs, not necessarily just at New Berlin West, but like I'm part of the Waukesha Coin Collecting Club. A little weird, but there's some interesting characters there, and you can always find. There's usually clubs in different places, and you'll meet some new people. Newsletters, maybe it's talking about something that's going on in New Berlin. The internet, obviously, you find a lot on the internet, and so I've done some research, and like Waukesha County even has actually quite the history. There's some things with Al Capone, and like you can go pretty far back and you can find some pretty interesting things. But yeah, literally anywhere. So kind of you want to really just get out and be a little nosy sometimes, obviously respectfully, but try and find some cool stories, things that make you question things. So like I wrote a article about the old pickle factory. So it's near Gatewood Park, but everyone called it Pickle Pond Park. And so like the rumor was that there was an old pickle factory there, but nobody knew for sure. So I did some research, and it led to an entire article. So there's some cool things. How to start. So you want to write a small outline of what you want your readers, there's a typo there, to get out of your article. And this helps you frame it. So often you can go down many rabbit holes, and you want to make sure you kind of know what you're looking for, but don't close yourself too much off, right? Maybe you're trying to find something, but it's not that great of a story. But maybe along the way, you might find something else that's interesting. And maybe that leads to a different story. So always keep an open mind. Don't get your heart set on one specific idea or like person or place too much, because you might find something else that's a little bit more interesting. So often, like I'm a teenager, so nobody's going to talk to me. So honestly, it doesn't matter. Like think of it as you're not a high school student, you're a journalist. So you can just say you're a journalist for the Norse code, and basically you can go and you can find some interesting people. So obviously and this tip specifically isn't necessarily in New Berlin West, obviously, but going outside of it, don't honestly, if you just take a risk and you do it, you can talk to some interesting people. Your email is your greatest tool. So almost everybody has an email, and you have one too. You may not have actually checked it since 7th grade orientation, but you have one. Everybody has an email, so go and send some emails out. So find the contact information for somebody, if it's a business or a person, and email away. Be persistent but respectful. So sometimes, you might just get some basic PR boring email, but if you dig a little deeper, you might find some interesting, or you can usually get in, excuse me, you can, if you're persistent but respectful, you can usually get some interesting conversations. And you have nothing to lose, so email the most interesting person you can find, obviously within reason. But anyone. So you won't always get a response. So maybe you need to find a new source, but don't always give up. Kind of also make notes of who you've contacted so you can kind of keep track of that. And nobody is too important. So one time I saw the mayor in the library, so I cornered him, and I started asking him questions, but it got me some interesting responses. So nobody's too important. Fun fact, one time a student tried to email a Russian oligarch. We're still awaiting a response. So maybe that's a little too far, but within reason, in New Berlin and Waukesha County and Wisconsin, you can contact representatives and stuff. So politicians aren't necessarily out of reach. I mean, I don't suggest Russian oligarchs, but you could try. And sometimes rabbit holes are good, emphasis on sometimes, but more specifically, don't just take information from one source. There are millions of sources, and I'm not going to be like don't make sure it's credible. Obviously, make sure it's credible, but, you don't want usually sometimes there'll just be a summary. But which leads me to find as many sources as you can, even if you don't use them all, right? Any kind of angle of anything. Maybe it's just even a couple things. And sources isn't just websites. So it's people, it's interviews, it's facts, it's statistics, it's articles, like other articles. Maybe it's from a book, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a flyer, a business card that leads you somewhere, or basically you just kind of gotta look. And if one source, so maybe it's a website and it says it took information from some source, go and look into that news source as well. So Wikipedia has references. So if you look at Wikipedia, usually go and look. Usually those are just briefly summarized parts of different things. And so they have footnotes. So they have little numbers by them. So click those and you'll get some references and look around, obviously. And again, diversify your sources. And even for websites, don't just look at the first couple of websites on Google. Hit the road. So the best interviews are conducted in person. So as of the time I'm recording this, we're in quarantine. So obviously don't go meet people in person. But specifically in the future, obviously, the best interviews are conducted in person. So while emails and phone calls are good, the best are in person. So go out and meet some people. So you can interview people outside New Berlin West. You can go to maybe it's somewhere in the industrial park of New Berlin, or maybe it's at the historic park, or maybe it's City Hall or the library or wherever. Go out and explore a little. Obviously, stay safe. Make sure the person you are interviewing knows you're coming. But no source is out of reach. So we had a reporter interview the founder of Funko, which is Funko Pops. They're the little figurines. So you can, again, obviously maybe Russian oligarch is a little extreme, but the founder of Funko, if you're persistent, and usually the reason why these people aren't contacted is because people think they'll never respond. Well, you don't know that unless you try. But again, social media. So depending on who you're contacting, you don't only have to use email. So the person that contacted the founder of Funko used Instagram. They just DM'd them and, they got a response. But Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook. So now I don't use Facebook, and most likely you probably don't. But you might want to download Facebook for this one thing. So there's a Facebook group called Community Connections of New Berlin, formerly known as, what was it? It was Concerned Citizens of New Berlin. And they So basically what it is, it's just a place where people talk about different things. There's usually a lot of rants on there, but it's very interesting. So it's a group, but you have to like send a request and you just say you're a citizen of New Berlin, and they let you in. And you can ask basically, maybe you want like the public's opinion. So you ask them things, and usually people on there are extremely opinionated, sometimes for better or for worse, usually for worse on there. But there will be obviously big arguments, but you can find some interesting sources, and maybe from there it leads to an in-person interview. But with interviews or like things like that, you always want to make sure you have their consent before you use a quote like that in your article. But spicy articles are awesome. So articles that go beyond the surface are the ones that get into the magazine. If you're just going for maybe a simple thing and you interview a person and you look on one website, it's probably not going to get into the magazine. So if you want articles in the magazine, you're gonna have to get your boots muddy, and you're gonna have to investigate a little bit. And in-depth articles are often more fun to write. It's kind of like being a detective. You go on some crazy adventures. I've gone on some adventures searching for articles and sources and things. But New Berlin, again, seems boring, but it's got a lot more stories to tell than you realize. And you just got to find those stories. And in-depth articles can win Kempa Awards. So Kempa is the Kettle Moraine Press Association. So every year we go to Whitewater. Usually I think it's in the fall. It's I think November, but we go there, and what it is, we go and you listen to different speakers, and they talk about basically student journalism and things. It's a really fun trip, and maybe you didn't go this year, but maybe there's always next year. And you can actually win awards. So they usually Mr. Allstat will submit various articles and things, and he'll submit our magazine and our website, and so you can win awards there. And you can never investigate too much. The Student Press Law Center has our backs, but obviously stay safe, but keep everybody in the loop. So if you're unsure about something, or you're confused, or you're stuck, talk to Mr. Allstat, and maybe you ask a section editor on how to make an article more detailed, or you ask an editor-in-chief for ideas for sources, because usually people have different experiences and they can offer different angles, or how to look at a different angle. But obviously make sure people know what you're doing. So tell Mr. Allstat if you're going to request public records and or legal documents. I learned that from experience. But go out and start writing in depth. So this is by no means a complete guide, but it's a start. And if you want to know about investigative or even just in-depth articles that have been written in the past, talk to Mr. Allstat. And again, in-depth articles can be arts and entertainment, they can be opinion, they can be features, they can be news, they can be anything. It doesn't have to be purely a feature story. And so whatever kind of story you want, you always want it to be in-depth. But obviously don't forget to have fun while you write. So that's how to write in-depth and investigative articles. And I just want you guys to go out and, find some great stories and